The 1920s seemed like a prosperous time. Employment was up, inflation was almost non-existent, production was up, per capita income was up, and it really seemed to support the laissez-faire capitalist practices of the Republicans that were in office during the 1920s. The problem was that this prosperity was mostly an illusion. There were signs throughout the 1920s and actually leading into the 1930s that the prosperity was about to crash, and eventually we can look back with hindsight and see why it crashed. During the 1920s, the income gap grew. The wealthy were getting wealthier, they were getting a higher proportion of the income, and the poor were getting more poor. In fact, a majority of the population was living below the poverty line, which would be about $2,500 in 1929. Today, that's roughly equivalent to about $13,000 a year. So wages were falling, even though productivity was up. Workers were working harder, but not getting paid as much. This means that the companies that were making all this money were not passing on the prosperity. They were not giving their workers higher wages, which means that even though we have this new consumer economy, the workers couldn't even buy the products that they were making. And oftentimes, this triggered that installment buying that we saw. Now, this is like that sugar rush for the economy. The population, middle class especially, the working class as well, were buying items on credit. But by the end of the 1920s, all of the installment credit had been taken up, and people had to start paying their bills back. They had run out of credit. This led to a drop in demand. That drop in demand meant that there was going to be a drop in spending. That drop in spending meant that the factories and the businesses had to lay off workers, which the cyclical nature of this means that once they laid off workers, the demand went down, spending goes down, which means more layoffs and so forth. So it's this vicious cycle that the country got into. One key misconception we need to avoid. The stock market crash did not cause the Great Depression. The Great Depression was caused by all of these other factors: overproduction, the wage gap, the income gap. The stock market crash signaled the start of the Great Depression. Much like when I sneeze, that doesn't cause my cold. It's merely a signal that I have a cold. During World War I, farmers were prospering in the United States. This is largely a result of supply and demand. During the war in Europe, there was very little in the way of farming going on because of the war-ravaged geography, as well as the fact that an entire generation of young farming-age men were expected to be at war. But in the 1920s, once the war is over, Europe is able to put that land back in production, and now American farmers were facing international competition. Again, using supply and demand, with this competition, there's more supply available, which drives down the prices of farm products. This is very similar to the 1890s when we saw the populist movement emerge. Farmers in 1920 were facing debt problems and tax problems because they weren't able to get as much for their crops. As farmers began to default on their loans, the banks began to lose money. If enough farmers defaulted on their loans, well, this means that the banks might actually crash. And when a bank crashed, all of the account holders in there lost whatever savings or checking account monies that they had. So this hurt everybody when a bank failed. Now, this is all before the Great Depression hits during the 1920s. In fact, it's estimated about 25% of farms are going to be defaulted on prior to the Great Depression. It's a cyclical thing again. Bank failures meant that there's less money available to be loaned out for small businesses, and banks that do stay in business are less willing to take the risk of loaning out that money. So when there's less money to loan out, that means that those businesses can't expand or be created and hire more people, which means there's less jobs. Less jobs means that there's less demand. Less demand means that less people are spending, which means layoffs, which means, again, another turn on that cycle. So farmers in the 1920s had a rough time. During the 1920s, the United States saw the Republican administration that had taken over, starting with Warren Harding and then Calvin Coolidge, and eventually with Herbert Hoover, overturned many of the pre-World War I progressive pieces of legislation that were designed to get rid of the monopolies and promote competition within the economy. This meant that there was a rollback towards laissez-faire policies. Under the Harding and Coolidge administration, they worked to limit government regulations, to stop protecting union rights as well. They overturned the legacy of the Sherman Antitrust Act and the trust-busting Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson's efforts too. So this laissez-faire environment led to an increasingly powerful corporation element within the government. In fact, they were able to raise the tariff in order to protect American businesses, which means, of course, with a tariff, you're eliminating foreign competition. In fact, they even were able to overturn some child labor laws and a women's minimum wage law. So during the 1920s, we have a move back away from progressive business ideology, more towards a laissez-faire capitalist policy, which has some interesting effects going into the Great Depression. With the return of laissez-faire policies in the government, the wealthy began having an increased influence as well. One of the ways that they used this influence was by convincing the government to decrease the income tax, slashing the rates on the wealthy. Remember, this was passed during the Progressive era under Wilson with the 16th Amendment. However, it had very little positive impact on the economy. There's a couple reasons for this. The wealthy tended to spend on luxury goods disproportionately. And what the wealthy were purchasing couldn't make up for the lost spending that the lost spending power of the majority of people that were not getting higher wages. Remember, the majority of the people living below the poverty line, so the wealthy weren't making up for the spending that the people below the poverty line weren't making. Also, the wealthy tended to put a lot of their tax savings into the stock market rather than into creating new businesses, expanding the businesses they had, creating new factories, which means that there weren't really any new jobs opening up. Because there weren't any of those new jobs, that means that the consumer spending is still very low, demand is still very low, and that's going to have other implications. What they were spending their money on was the stocks, and because of this, we often refer to this as speculation, essentially gambling in the stock market. The businesses that people were spending their money in the stock market on weren't really worth the amount that they were being given per stock. So most businesses couldn't give a return on the investment that was assumed by the value of the price of the stock because of the low demand, which means that the value of the stock was false. The value of the stock was not worth what people thought it was worth. It was overinflated. After overproducing throughout the 1920s and then slowing on that production leading towards the end of the 1920s, these businesses that now had these overvalued stocks were beginning to seem overvalued. And the investors began to question the true value of the stocks. And in this system, once the value of the stock is being questioned, everything sort of falls apart. When one thinks of the Great Depression, one often thinks of the stock market crash of 1929. Please remember, though, that stock market crash is a symptom of the Great Depression, not a cause of the Great Depression. The stock market crash itself is a result of the 1920s installment buying culture and the get-rich-quick mentality of the era. The stock market crash was caused partially because there was an assumption that the value of the stocks would always go up. It's also caused by the fact that there is no regulation on the market. So when you combine this assumption that the values of the stocks are going to always increase and there's nobody keeping tabs on it, investors started to do a lot of speculating, and they started to do a lot of poor decision making. One of the poor decisions is referred to as buying on margin. What this means is that a investor could borrow up to 90% of the value of the stock. So if you had a $10 stock, you could borrow $9 and only have to pay $1. The reason that this is a big deal, though, is because that meant that stock investors could purchase more stock. So if they had $10, they would buy 10 stocks worth $100 rather than one stock at 10. This means that the investors could make much higher profit. It also means that they had a lot more debt. The assumption that the value of the stock would always go up meant that the stock investors would sell off the stock later, pay off their loan, and then collect whatever was left over at a higher profit. The problem is that in October of 1929, there was a large sell order. And supply and demand being what it is, the illusion of the value cracked. When more people were selling, all of a sudden the brokers got nervous, the people that gave the loans, and they called in those loans. They wanted that 90% back. The investors had to sell, and when you increase the supply of the stocks, that means the value of all the stocks go down. So the investors had to sell to pay off the loans, the value of the stocks went down, and we have again this cyclical nature of the supply and demand and this vicious cycle. Banks did try to prop up the markets and hope that they would bounce back, but to no avail. And on Tuesday, often called Black Tuesday, I believe it is October 29th, 1929, the false prosperity of the 1920s finally cracked, and we enter into the Great Depression. After the stock market crashed, the economy went into another vicious cycle spurred on by individual choices of companies and businesses and individuals themselves. One organization that was supposed to help this but actually hurt the economy was the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a bank for banks, and it controls the money supply. There's a few other things it does, but that's the important part. In the 1920s, the Federal Reserve had pursued easy credit, made it easy for people to get loans. They did this by keeping the interest rates low, and you don't need to know all the details of it. But they kept the interest rates low, which meant that it was easier to borrow money. These low interest rates were used by those wealthy stock investors to buy more stocks, and it really helped fuel the stock speculation that ends up leading to the stock market crash. As the 1920s started coming to a close, one of the reasons that the stock market sort of had issues was that the Fed tightened up its money supply, which means that it made it harder to get loans in order to try to discourage this stock market speculation. They did this, of course, by increasing interest rates. When the stock market finally did crash, the Fed took the wrong lesson. They took the lesson that they had too much loose money, and that caused the stock market speculation, which led to the crash. What they did after the crash was tighten up the money supply, which means they made it even more difficult to get a loan. Made it even more difficult to help ease the burdens of the crash. So businesses could not get loans, which would have helped to stimulate the economy by creating more jobs or re-putting money into the stock market. So instead of loosening up the money supply, which may have eased the Great Depression's intensity or length, the Fed actually tightened up money, made it harder to get loans, which is going to also prolong some of the Great Depression experiences. Much like the Federal Reserve didn't do much to help things out, the government in the late 1920s didn't do much to help out people either. One thing that they did do to try to help was pass a protective tariff. This actually has a counterintuitive effect. The tariff was designed to help protect businesses from foreign competition, which made a lot of sense back in Hamilton's day. But in this era, people bought more than just locally. Remember, we'd gone through the age of American imperialism where we had this now global marketplace. And what happened when America passed a higher tariff in the 1930s was that it actually led to a depression of international trade, which means with this high tariff, foreigners couldn't sell their products in the United States. And without having money from selling products in the United States, they didn't have any dollar bills to buy American products. This in turn lowered the demand for those American goods. So rather than helping to protect American industries by creating the tariff, it actually depressed American industries even further. Also, in response to the American tariff, foreign nations passed their own tariffs. They set up their own trade barriers, and this meant that even more trade was lost worldwide. So now no foreign countries were buying American products, and Americans couldn't sell their products in foreign countries. All in all, these big tariffs of this era really just harmed the world economy rather than helping out a national economy. President Herbert Hoover was in office when the Great Depression hit, and while he did more than any other president had done in previous crashes, he didn't do a whole lot to help ease the human suffering of the Great Depression. Traditionally, the United States has had a waited out mentality with the economy. The ups and downs of a capitalist system were nothing new to Americans. They believed that the market would always find a new equilibrium. Remember, it's kind of like a roller coaster. For every peak, there's a valley, and for every valley, there's a peak. The United States had gone through recessions and depressions in the past. In fact, throughout the Gilded Age, there was a major recession or depression about once every 7 or 8 years. The issue was that people didn't realize how intense the depression was going to be based on sort of the false prosperity that was built up during the 1920s. When the Depression did hit, people assumed that it would be over relatively quickly. In fact, Herbert Hoover kept talking about how prosperity would be right around the corner and that we should just pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, and promoted this idea of rugged individualism. He did go and ask companies for voluntary efforts to keep hours and wages the same. But in the face of low consumer spending and demand, the companies just couldn't do this. They would make promises to Hoover, and then months later they would have to lay off workers or cut hours in order to save money. In the face of this rugged individualism, Hoover, who logical sense to his actions, really had a lot of issues with how things looked, right? The appearance of things. In fact, in one case, because he wanted to help people out but didn't want to just give money directly to the individuals, he would often try to help their businesses. And in one sort of spectacular case, he apparently gave money to pig farmers so that they could feed their pigs, but refused to give money directly to the farmers. Now, makes logical sense. Feed the pigs, then you can sell the pig and feed your family. But the appearance of that was that he cared more about the pigs than the farmers' kids. The Great Depression was the worst economic disaster to ever hit the United States, especially up to that time. It had a devastating impact on everybody's life. Unemployment rate reached about 25%. If you take out the farm workers, and if you look just at industrial workers, the peak of the Great Depression is about 40% unemployment within the industrial sector. What made matters worse was that the United States had no system of a social safety net, no unemployment insurance. Unable to pay mortgages, unable to pay rent, unable to pay their bills, people just left their homes. They went to the streets, they wandered from town to town, they were looking for jobs. They would sell apples or pencils or whatever they could, door to door, trying to make any income. If you were lucky enough to have your job wages cut, hours taken away. Because of this, people stopped purchasing anything but the most essential items. Demand dropped, which meant that there was further layoffs, which meant that prices fell even further and demand fell even further. And the United States has continued to go into this vicious cycle of the Great Depression, largely because of the cyclical nature of this Great Depression. One of the more devastating events during a Great Depression was the bank run. Now, a bank run is when an individual bank has all of its money taken out. Banks don't keep all of your money locked up in the safe. Banks loan that money out to people so that they can start new businesses or build a house, and then that money does come back in over time. That's how banks make a profit. They charge interest on those loans, they make the profit off of that. The problem with a bank run is that when people assume or think that the bank is going to run out of money, everybody runs to the bank to get that money out. But because not all of the money is in the bank, only a fraction of the people that have money in the bank are able to get their money. This means that people panic if they even assume that the bank has a possibility of closing. So it's a panicked rush of withdrawals, and that panicked rush of withdrawal means that the bank is going to collapse. And anybody that has an investment in there that isn't one of the first few people ends up losing their savings as a result. The Great Depression had a horrific effect on the human costs in the United States. You're probably familiar with some of the classic scenes of the Great Depression. The soup lines, the bread lines, Hoovervilles, the Dust Bowl, and the Okies that were fleeing the Dust Bowl to California. Where people were, they tended to be undernourished, not having enough food. Schools tended to close because communities couldn't afford to pay the teachers, and some teachers even worked for free. More upsetting was the effect that the Great Depression had on families. Marriages are going to be delayed. Couldn't afford a wedding. Birth rates are going to fall because you don't want to have a baby that you're afraid is going to starve to death. This is actually a classic sign of a bad economy. When the economy is really bad, birth rates fall. When the economy is good, birth rates go up. We're going to see that happen after World War II. When the economy is great, we have the baby boom. But during the Great Depression, the birth rate fell dramatically. Interestingly enough, the divorce rate dropped, but that's because people just weren't hiring lawyers. Many men just abandoned their family during this time. One of the reasons they abandoned the family was because they felt unmanly. Unemployed men couldn't provide, so many men felt shame at that. Women and children are forced to go into the workplace, taking whatever menial job they might find in order to feed their families. So the Great Depression had this tremendous human cost on the population, not economic costs, but just the way that people were being treated and the way that they were felt and the suffering that they went through. During the Great Depression, states and private charities had no way to really make up for the lack of employment. There was no such thing as unemployment insurance at this time, and there certainly wasn't the social safety net that we have in 2015, 16, 17. In order to alleviate the suffering of the Great Depression, many individuals began to look to the federal government. We have this wonderful wealth of letters, the people writing to Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt after their election, asking for ways to help their husbands find a job or ways to help feed their families. One classic example of this search for the federal government's assistance is called the Bonus Army Marchers. This Bonus Army March was early on in the Depression, right towards the end of Herbert Hoover's term in office. The Bonus Army was a group of veterans that were promised a bonus at the end of the 1930s. They had fought in World War I, and as a thank you, the government had promised them a bonus during that time of great prosperity in the 1920s. Unfortunately, the Great Depression hit, and the Bonus Army Marchers, these veterans, said they couldn't wait until the end of the 30s in order to get that bonus. They needed it now. So they all went to Washington, D.C., and they set up a Hooverville outside of the D.C. Capitol, and they went to Congress and asked for their bonus early. They would even take a prorated version of it, a less amount of money. The Congress voted on it. They decided not to give the bonus to the marchers until the promised time. And they asked the veterans to disband, to leave, to go away, but they didn't have anywhere to go. Some did leave, but many stayed on in that Hooverville. Hoover wants to run as a candidate of law and order. He can't run on his economic record because of the Great Depression. He wants to get reelected. He needs to try to get those veterans away. He sends in the police don't work. Then he sends in General MacArthur in order to try to get them to leave. And eventually one thing leads to another, that Hooverville is on fire. So now Hoover looks like the guy who's burning out veterans, and it really ruins any chance he had for re-election, if there was any. During the Great Depression, farmers faced an environmental disaster as well as an economic disaster. The farmers had already suffered throughout the 1920s because of the laws of supply and demand and the return of European crops into the supply. However, during the Great Depression, they're going to suffer through the Dust Bowl as well. The plains are a fragile environment. There's very few trees to hold the soil to the ground. The plains had also been overgrazed since the 1890s, meaning that a lot of the grass that was holding the sod down was gone. During World War I, that boom time for the farmers, farmers had plowed up much more of the plains in order to produce more food, and they had planted more wheat, which had an effect on the sod. So there was less sod, which destroyed the soil. That held the soil down. And when a drought came in the early 30s, all of that dirt turned into dust. And as the winds blew through, all of that topsoil was blown away, and really had a huge tragedy for families. Because they couldn't grow anything, because the dust would just come by and cover it, and the topsoil was gone, many of the farmers that were tenant farmers were evicted from their land. They had to become migrant workers. We call them Okies, largely because they're moving from Oklahoma to California in search of work. So by the time we get to the 1932 election, these farmers and the rest of the Americans are really desperate for help from the federal government.